I'll run through the victims on the sofa for you one by one. And we'll start on the left. And to my left is Daniel Lee, who you will know is MD of Hewshott International. To his left, as you've seen, is Gary Keene, Manager AV Google UK. It's a very understated title, isn't it, really? I mean, they should give you something more grand than that, shouldn't they? Really? But I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Manager AV, but there we are. Chris Lavelle, who is a Regional Director of AVIXA, who you heard earlier. To his left is Toni Barnett, MD of CDEC. And at the end is, I don't say at the end, he's last but by no means least, is the celebrated Mr. Marcus Saunders from the University of the Arts, who's titled Academic Technologist. Recently, there have been instances where new developments and establishments have deliberately not included any large lecture theatres for teaching delivery in their plans. Is this something that the panel thinks is forward-thinking, or a decision they may regret in time? Which I thought was a cracker, actually. Now, who would like to tackle that first? Marcus, do you want to have a quick go on that one? I thought it was quite a bit worrying, but I don't want to be a bit of an old frumpy, knowing that workspaces are being developed. Perhaps that's the natural step on.
Yeah, I think the quick answer is no. I don't think the lecture theatre is dead. I think it's going to change in terms of how we provision for it. And I think the balance of that space typology, so the number of large lecture halls versus more flexible collaborative spaces, will change. But I don't think it's dead by any means. So the other thing I wanted to say is just point out in the audience we have someone from the University of Northampton. I think it's Andrew over there. Put his hands up. So if you want to talk to a campus that's eliminating lecture theatres, I think you're building just 3, is that right? So at the next break, he's the guy to go and talk to about the thinking behind that process. It's very interesting. It's about removing transmissive teaching and moving towards active learning, which I think is a very useful approach.
Gary, I know you've been on earlier about this, but do people have... it's a bit of a dilemma, isn't it? People have a formal view of what a space or a room should be, yet they want something different, but don't actually say they don't want what they have. It's very difficult to understand what they do want and how you can build it and deliver it, if you understand me. You've been through that with Google, haven't you? And to deliver what you have done and say you can do it within 24 hours, it's extraordinary. I still don't quite know how you're doing it, but I mean, to get away from something as traditional as lecture theatres, that's a dramatic step and actually quite a change-thinking thing to do. So, I mean, it's easy to say you're an evangelist, but how do you decide whether you don't need a traditional space anymore and something new needs to be done?
So, okay.
That seems beyond our remit almost to a point,
Sure.
doesn't it? You know.
So, when we're planning a new building, typically we're leading with a small number of questions. And there'll be the initial planning meetings, which will take place between the real estate team, the architect, the lead architect, the designers, and what we call the site leads. So the site leads are the senior business heads whose teams are moving into this space. Site leads are also tasked with being setting the culture in that particular site. So my ultimate boss is a guy called Ben Freed. He's the CIO at Google. He's the New York site lead. It's his responsibility to set the culture for Google in New York. But that range of questions that we ask is designed to facilitate what genuinely is needed, as opposed to looking backwards to say what have we historically done and why are we looking to replicate that. So we start every project with a clean sheet of paper, and we're looking at the business assumptions that lead us to design that's going to deliver facilities that work for that team or for those teams in that space over a period of time. So we question everything, and we start with the assumption that we're not replicating anything that we've previously done.
Is there any sort of advice or best practice approach we can give people on these things? Is there anywhere they can go to that... I mean, this is an incredible thing. There's so many different elements to this. It's not just about a basic build. It's about a concentration of skills that are way beyond the traditional AV and manager type of approach. I mean, as a consultant, what sort of lead can we give people? I mean, this is a massive thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think like everything in this industry, it all comes back to requirement. So it's about not building a space because we're a higher education institution. We don't necessarily need a lecture theatre just because we're a university. So like all of these things, it's about starting with requirements. I think in terms of the lecture theatre specifically, I think a couple of things have changed. The first one is that you could build a space like this 15 years ago, quite safe in the knowledge that you would teach in it in the same way for the next at least 5 years, maybe 10, that nothing would change, that the style of teaching was going to remain the same. And I think what's happening now is that the spaces need to be flexible day to day, but also more quickly adaptable. So a space like this is great for this purpose. It's good for 450 people to listen to 1 or 4 or 6 people speak, but you can't do much else with it. So I think it's more now about the seminar type spaces, the flatter, physically flatter spaces that are more adaptable and more quickly changeable. And it's just because the pace of change in everything, including styles of teaching, is so rapid now compared to the way it was.
I mean, what worries me is how you get feedback. Do you do some sort of requirements analysis that keeps you up to date with how a space is being used and therefore leads you to perhaps at some point rethink what that space should be doing?
So for us, it's a really interesting one because we do a huge amount of needs analysis at the beginning of a project. So we speak to as many different stakeholders as we can. We speak to AV and IT support people, we speak to students, we speak to lecturers, we speak to all the different people that we use that space or interact with that space in one way. And we put together systems and designs of spaces that meet those requirements. What we rarely get to do is review that later in the process. And actually, it's something that we would really enjoy doing. I think a number of the institutions do a good job of it themselves. Gary talked this morning about the survey that they send out. I know that a number of organisations do that. But for us, unfortunately, until it comes to a refresh, which is generally a number of years later, we don't often get a huge amount of feedback, which is a shame.
Which leads into the next question, is how often should someone reevaluate how that space is being used?
That's
Marcus,
a tricky question.
what about, you were nodding earlier on. Have you got something to...
So I think the cycles that drive room refresh on campus need to be re-evaluated. I don't think they're working they're not working for the users of that space. So if you're talking about the experience people have going into seminar rooms, lecture spaces, I think everyone's got the sense that that could be improved or tweaked. And I think some of the presentation earlier from Gary around how do universities think about design. I think the delineation of responsibility between integrators, etc., and the roles that they have. I think the universities need to do what they're good at and look at how they design for particular pedagogy or particular approach, and then apply that design and be more agile in how they respond.
Is there a regular dialogue now between that level in the universities and the AV estate, or whatever you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the context for us is slightly
now,
different because we're building new buildings, and that's the focus. So you're on a kind of prescribed timeline, so everybody's thinking about it in a very different way. So that helps as a catalyst. But I think in general, the conversations around cost, obviously, it's an important one. It's about how expensive are these rooms to build? Why are we building it if it's not working, if it's a 120-year-old model? How do we move that on? It's quite tricky.
I mean, I can see you're more likely to get cost approval and probably a lot of support for something that's brand new or is a huge step on from what you had originally. But not, I think human nature, and once you got up, oh, that's it then for a few years. We can just sit down, relax, let it go. We've spent a lot of money on it so far, just let it go. And we're into an era now where it's continuous change, isn't it? As we know, different generations of students are starting to come up with newer and newer demands and new pedagogies, presumably.
Yeah, but I think one of the key aspects is about how we engineer in simplicity into that, how we make things much more straightforward from a user experience perspective or a workplace experience perspective, and do that with fewer components and with very, very simple and consistent interaction between how you use a room and the purpose it's designed for. Do
you feel it's been in the past over-engineered then by that logic?
Very much so.
Well, that's a revelation, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit like that going in corporates. I mean, Barclays is trying to do exactly that, keep it simple, whereas others are trying to do as fully functional as they can to cover every eventuality. And then Deutsche Bank is right, I'll give them what they want. If they don't use it, we'll take it away. Everybody's got a different approach to the whole thing. But, you know, there's so many variations on the thought towards not just the space, but the technology. It's very difficult for someone like me to come back to, that's the answer to that solution then. it's a very quickly moving, almost amoeba-like subject, isn't it? And how on earth we're supposed to be skilled enough to be able to come up with the right answers every time is well beyond me, actually, because we're looking at new skills, new cultural skills, and so on. And I've seen the same people for 7 years face the most horrendous of challenges. They come out, well, this is a perfect example, you know. Amazing, really. I do look at the education sector, and I think it can show really the corporate sector what to do, you know. The challenges are quite horrendously complex, and our corporates can learn, can't they, Ezra?
Most certainly, yeah, definitely can do. I think one of the changes that we've made over the last couple of years that's really helped us, and this is sort of going back to the point that Marcus made, is to formalise the piloting process and to be continuously experimenting as well. So, you know, as an organisation, we do create products as well. We're putting a significant investment into an enterprise arm, so you'll see more Google collaborative products coming out. With the product managers there, what we do is we take the estate that we have and we offer it to them. So we have like a piloting as a service program that a product manager can come to. And what we say is, if you give us your early stage product, we'll get it out there and we will test it in a way that will get you much higher quality feedback at a pace that you wouldn't be able to get yourself. So we turn the estate into an asset which helps develop better product faster. And that also gives us an insight into what those products are doing, and it allows us to take a long-term view on how to eventually integrate them as well. So that's the approach that we've taken.
Well, that's something HE could really benefit from, because my next question was, how do you keep up with new and changing technologies? And in a sense, if you're extending that sort of logic, it's very easy then to start to think, well, rather than just evaluating technology in a very traditional way, which we have done, you then start to make more of a closer integrated link with the environment they're suited for. And that's a very different kind of evaluation. I mean, as an integrator, I mean, how on earth how do people come to you? I mean, what sort of demands are they? It's very, from an integrated perspective, what do you see of all this? Is it quite complex or straight? You know, it's difficult to second guess, isn't it? No,
it is, because every establishment is different, and everybody wants something different, you know, and that's the world we're in. It's similar, but it's not, because people are teaching in different ways. I mean, we go all the way from primary right up to university and into the corporate world. So we see so much, you know, such a difference all the way through. But it's similar, you know, but we've got to stay abreast of everything, so it is hard. What
sort of demands? Sorry, do you want to say anything? You want to jump in?
I do. I was just going to say, I think
move on. No.
Just because it follows on from that, I think the interesting thing where this question is concerned is not. It's slightly different for suppliers, but for end users, it's not necessarily a question of how do you stay abreast of all these things or how do you keep up with all the latest technologies. It's do you need that to deliver the service you're trying to deliver? So one of the questions we ask most of all is why. So we'll go and meet with a CIO and he'll say, I want device XYZ in all the meeting rooms. Why do you want that device? Because I saw it at a show and it looked great. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about what it actually does, and do you actually need any of that stuff? So I think there is a drive, and it's more so, I think, in corporate than I see in higher education. But there is a desire to be at the cutting edge, if not the bleeding edge, and actually that may not be what's best suited for the requirement. So again, you know, like I mentioned before, requirements is where it all begins, and often people want to start with technology and wrap the requirements around them, whereas the right approach, we think, and the approach we take, is to start with the requirements and wrap the minimum level of technology around those.
I mean, bearing in mind from your school level that they will be a future generation of people coming into hopefully higher education. How would you say the demands of technology in schools is preparing these pupils for a lifestyle in HE? I mean, are the schools preparing them well for going into actually a very highly digital environment when they get to universities?
Well, yeah.
Apart from occasional odd phone, you know, which is
the schools. What's happened is in AV is in actual fact it's a bit like the whiteboards. Everybody thought the growth into the interactive screen would be quite slow. It's actually been the opposite. It's been very, very quick. And we're now on a cycle now of them having them for 5 years. And my God, that product has changed. It's so intelligent now. And there's such a range of products out there. And it's really about, we take the same view. It's not, oh, I've seen that, I want to buy it. It's how do you teach? What's your needs? You know, what do you actually need in order to deliver your class? And that's how we work it, is, you know, we don't go in there to sell a particular product. We sit and listen. That's what we do. And then we suggest a product around how they teach and how they work.
Can I come in there? I think the hardest thing to shift in a university, in my experience, has been culture around technology. And I think, you know, the slightly uncomfortable truth is that the spectrum that you're dealing with academic colleagues for take-up of technology or interventions in teaching space is fairly low. There's always going to be that 10% that want to try something or embed something in their delivery. But then the rest, it's only really going to be taken up if it genuinely makes life better. Yeah. So I think our job is to try and distill the choices that people have, and try and be, you know, whatever the equivalent is to the interactive whiteboard or the smart boards for primary schools, we have to think about what our audience is and how we provide that really simple hybrid approach.
Well, the younger the children, it's proved that they soak up knowledge, don't they, and they react to things and are better, earlier adopters, they adopt technology better than students later on, don't they? It's been going earlier and earlier as the cycles have been going on. Yet, unfortunately, it's very difficult for us to get to know what's going on in schools. The communication is very difficult for a magazine to plumb in on, because they don't really communicate with us in the way I would like. So I'd like to improve those channels, actually, because they are our future, after all, and they will dictate what we invest in, presumably, in the higher education space as time goes on.
The experience is just as important as the technology, as you say. So the lecture theatre experience is connected with going to university. I was talking to Marcus last night about libraries. So we were talking about Oxford in particular. So real estate in the city centre is very expensive. You could digitise all the books. You could put them in a bunker somewhere much cheaper. But people want the experience of going to a library that is connected to the university, you know, and browsing the shelves and, you know, that kind of thing. So it's really important not to sacrifice experience for technology's sake, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the equivalent to that was Parsons in New York, who only hold 10% of their books because they're a central Manhattan campus. And then because of the sort of Amazon model, people get the book the next morning. They order it through their phone and it's there. And sometimes I think, well, which of those two, you know, is there a blend of that works well? They curate that 10% so that it's relevant to the students in that particular term, which is a good approach. And if you start thinking about how Gary approaches almost AV as a service, so if you need it, it's there 24 hours later, perhaps we need to be thinking more along those lines. What does that cohort need, or that school need, or that group or collection of people need for the next week?
Chris?
Sorry, Clive, it's mentioned just a couple of things that were touched on, and I think it comes down to in terms of the space and talking about the lecture theatre, it also depends on the quantity of students you have to teach. It's a nice idea to have a very interactive space. There's lots of cool high-end tech that's very expensive to do per room that holds a maximum of X amount of people, whereas a lecture theatre can hold hundreds of people. And going back to, there's been a lot of talk about the students and the student experience and demands, etc. But ultimately, when I went to the UNIS conference in Germany a few months ago, and that had a lot of CTOs and CIOs from universities, a couple of things came out, and one of the things was the cultural differences from the lecturer's perspective. So in Germany, they want to almost be on a pedestal, and they don't like the flat level of teaching, the interactive space that this student might have something to say that might actually be better than my opinion, etc. And they're quite sensitive to that. And we had somebody talking about Australian universities, and they're very cutting edge, big budgets, very competitive, a lot of private customers. And that probably, I would say, it seems, I could be wrong, but in terms of collectively, Australia seems to be leading the world with the amount of money spent in universities collectively. But it goes back to the budget question which was raised, and speaking to these people, they have a lot of pressure, like particularly Southern Europe, have a lot of pressure about their budget, and it's like, are you absolutely sure that, if you plant these 5 acorns, we will get 5 oak trees? That the pressure is immense. And an auditorium like this, they would just, dream of, etc. And then other parts of the world also repurpose the space. So there's a university in Columbia that they wanted to build a state-of-the-art lecture theatre, and they did that by leasing it out to the public as a music space when it's not being used by the university. So there are various factors that might have an influence on the space, but definitely the huddle spaces and the interactive teaching rooms are very popular in the UK, which you've seen. But it is interesting to see how across Europe how this changes.
I mean, one thing that certainly in education hasn't been discussed anywhere as far as I know is what academics think. Has anybody actually asked what the academics? No, well, this is why we're here. You see, this is why we're here to throw the occasional knob of butter into the equation. Does that dialogue really need to start? Well, it's the same with me. Editors are the same thing. I nearly met a reader once. Because of course they want to read what I write. How dare they not want to do that? You have the same sort of thing. So I have total understanding of all that. However, it's the same. We were talking about a guy last night who was using his dad's slides in physics. And he was absolutely mortified that somebody had nicked them. He'd be using it for 2 generations. Well, physics doesn't change. Why should I change? Somebody nicked all his folios, Think, my God, there are a lot of people like that out there. And actually, to get their input into all this actually could transform the whole delivery, really. And they should be part of the equation. And they appear not to be. Now, is it just because we don't get on with them, or they just don't bother to engage, or they're not educated, or they'll be retiring soon, just let them potter on? Is it down to that, or is there something more involved? I think students have it far too easy, the lecture capture, God knows what else. I like to see the pain coming back into education, where they actually have to do some physical work. They don't have stuff recorded for them. They can appreciate the huge lengths that people go to create fantastic learning environments for them. And perhaps I don't see that. I've been walking around the campus, actually, early this morning and looking at attitudes, and they're all there just expecting it to be done for them. I mean, we expected things not to be done for us and things not to work. And actually, we became more resourceful and we had a completely different attitude to it. I think that perhaps, with all this fantastic technology, we've lacked a robustness in the educational process that I would like to see back into it. A bit more pain in tutorials when things aren't working. More of an amazing inspiration from a lecturer who doesn't use any technology at all. I think we're losing a bit of that, I fear, with all this. Perhaps that's just me being miserable, I don't know. But I do sense a bit of that.
We did a poll on, we spoke to lots of students when we did a piece of work for University in London, and you just made me think of it when you talked about lecture capture. One of the things we asked them about was lecture capture, and we asked them a few questions, and the academics were very interested that the responses were the opposite of what they expected. So is lecture capture a useful tool? Is it a good thing? And actually, a lot of the students responded, it is. However, if I've made the effort to get to the lecture, why should somebody who hasn't be able to review that content afterwards? So actually, they felt that if you'd attended in person, that should be available to you afterwards, but you shouldn't have been able to stay in bed for a week and then catch up over the course of the weekend. They were asked a question, how do you feel if it takes 5 to 10 minutes to set up the AV at the beginning of a lecture? The academics expected the response, well, we can have a chat, we can catch up on Facebook, we can do those things. The response from the students was, we're paying for a service, we arrive at 10 o'clock, it doesn't start till 10 past, that's not an acceptable level of service. So jumping back to that shift that's happening where it's all about the students, I think people expect them to say one thing and to be thinking one thing because they're students, the great unwashed, all that. But they're changing, I think, in terms of their requirements and their expectations.
It's service delivery, rather than... the thing is, I have to say, I have to go back to the old fart syndrome again and say that, lectures were there to be delivered, not recorded. And that the work was done before you got to the lecture and in the tutorials and everything else. A lecture there was not to spoon-feed you information, but to genuinely inspire and give you ideas about what you were doing about the rest of it. One lecture a week was all you needed to have an inspirational guide, pick up the main points and go. It wasn't there to sort of write every word down, but to be inspired by someone who could make you think differently about what you were studying. And we seem to have gone a bit beyond that. And now, well, I'm paying for this, I expect that to be delivered here. That's the lecture, okay, a bit late, should have been here at 10:14. Where's my information? I'm paying for this. That does worry me a bit, actually. I think the pedagogy needs to fight back a bit to actually saying, and actually, those delivering it need to be a bit more robust, I would say, and not to be threatened by technology. It can enhance their performance, but also get the students to working a bit. Don't be afraid by some of these demands they're making, I think, because I think we are being a bit slavish to it sometimes. And we get into a round where it's eternal user requirements, and we get the point of why we're there in the first place, to actually learn something. The technology is very much underpinning it. I mean, a lot of guff's been spoken about AI, hasn't it, really? But do you feel, where do you think it's going to come into AV in a sort of sensible, practical way?
It's an interesting question. I think, for me personally, I've had a little pet project to develop an AI that uses very, very basic approach to try and work out what type of problem someone's having. So using the right syntax, the right language, it will work out whether that's an AV type problem and whether it's this type of an AV type problem.
Really?
From an interaction, a natural language interaction.
Wow.
I think for me where that's useful, and I think it's something that we're just starting to unpack. We haven't really explored it in AV in universities perhaps, is, well, I can have 400 conversations like that running across the buildings at once, and even if that's just the first line, that then passes that problem on to a AV technician who can then work with that person to fix the issues, or can look at the systemic issues that you're just describing and think about how we then design around them. That as a process is really sort of untapped territory. So that's interesting to me. Think about what an AV person's job will look like in 5 years in a university campus, and what the technologies that will be that will help that person understand their day-to-day function and role. Very
interesting, isn't it? Have you thought about anything like that? About how the role of AV is developing? Clearly with the experience thing, it's kicked off a whole load of new thinking, hasn't it? Really, we have, however, been going on for quite a while. But it's materialising now into actually practical. This is how we do it type of stuff, isn't it?
I think it sounds like a really exciting project, and it's something that we probably want to hear more about and how it goes. But this almost like a collection of data and system learning.
We can all adopt that. We can all adopt that, actually, can't we?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to how is everything being used, and going back to collecting of data for a more efficient system and not wasting money, not wasting time, etc. But that sounds like an interesting project.
Gary's obviously already doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you were talking about microphone monitoring when in a room a microphone becomes a single stable individual speaker, and you can imagine applying. You're already applying the measurement and analytics to that to inform design, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess universities are a really good place for that kind of developmental activity.
Yeah.
So we should be doing that.
Yeah.
And again, for us, it wasn't a major investment.
Yeah.
It was an idea that came up about 18 months ago, and it took us a couple of weeks to have a usable prototype. Just sort of picking up on the implications of the points you were making. When we do a lot of peer review for anything that we're looking to take out of pilot into production. And the one question you are guaranteed you will always get asked is, how will this scale? And again, that forces you to think through the implications of any service change that you're looking at. And again, I'm thinking that for the audience here, taking that question into account is going to be an increasingly important part of what you're doing, and will be a significant change going forwards as well. What are the most important skills we're going to be needing over the next few years, do you reckon, with all this change going on? UX.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And where are they going to come from?
You can throw a stick and hit UXers. There's a lot of them about. For us, where we're struggling at the moment is the concept of the UX of a room. So with products and interfaces, we have in-house UXers who work on that. It's part of developing a product. We're struggling, and so I am actively looking at the moment if anyone's interested. But we are actively struggling to find UX professionals who look at a room as a product that has UX tests attached to it as well. So the ability to look long-term at a product or a development that you might bring into that environment and to set up a series of experiments that genuinely uncover the value of that thing, I see that as being a core skill. I think the industry for a very long time has, again, I'm just repeating what was said earlier, it's like, oh, this is new, or this is tech, let's get hold of it and let's put it out there without an appreciation for the actual difference that it's going to make. So, I mean, to give you a practical example, I've got a study that's running in the first quarter of next year. So we've launched the Jamboard product, so again, an interactive whiteboard. I'm neutral on it. I don't think it will become ubiquitous. I don't think we'll have it in every meeting room like we do video conferencing. So I'm the gatekeeper for that as well. And what I've insisted on is a proper UX study. So what that means is we'll be putting Jamboards into different parts of the business to understand the delta of the impact that it's having on collaborative outcomes in sales as opposed to engineering and in HR as opposed to legal. We're putting it into different territories as well to find out if there's a cultural impact, and also to find out how it works with remote teams and virtual workers as well. And we're dropping it into different points of the project cycle. Because again, we've got a hunch that it's more likely to be used at brainstorming parts of a project, but we don't know that. We need to test it out. And for us, what we'll do with that data is that will actually drive our adoption strategy, because we've got an objective set of data we can work with there that begins to give us insight into the value that this thing delivers in certain parts of the business. Yeah? And I think, again, that type of thinking will become increasingly relevant to what we do, because again, it neutralizes a lot of the arguments that have been going on around, well, why should we do this? Again, if you can show where there's a value to it, then who would stop you from going ahead with that?
Of course.
So it all comes back, I think, to being able to set those experiments up and to ask the right questions, which is UX.
Yes, okay. Interesting. Marcus, yeah, you were saying?
I was just going to say, I think that the shift of AV across to the network stack is a really important skill. You were talking about what skills do we think people are going to need going forward. So I think having multidisciplinary AV staff who understand the infrastructures that we'll be building in 3, 4, 5 years is increasingly difficult to find, but actually the demand is also increasing. So that's just something I'd watch for.
Thank you. Are you all going to be around the rest of the day? People to follow this stuff up on? I mean, it's fascinating. I've never gone to that, actually. Firm advocate of UX, brilliant. Nice to hear that you say that. Okay, thank you very much to the panel, and thank you very much for contributing. Very good.